Hello everyone, we continue with looking at games from the challenges section of Tata Steel 2024, and now we have a game between Grandmaster Mustafa Yilmaz and Grandmaster Daniel Dardha with the black pieces. Yilmaz started with d4 and we have d5, c4 and d takes c4. The Queen's Gambit accepted. This is not something we see very often. Knight f3 and knight f6. e3, opening the bishop's attack to the pawn. a6, we'll push the bishop away with b5 later on. Bishop takes c4 and e6 first, and white castles. c5, challenging in the center right away. Knight c3 and b5. Of course, if bishop b3, then we can even play c4. That's also possible. But bishop e2 and bishop b7, developing on a very nice diagonal. D takes c5. Knight c6, we'll grab the pawn later, but we are preparing to swap queens on our own terms with bringing the rook to d8, and white obliges. Queen takes d8 and rook takes d8. Bishop d2, developing. Bishop takes c5, also developing. Rook fc1, we want to keep the a rook on the a file so that we can push the a pawn at some point of time. Bishop d6, not allowing any discoveries, and bishop to e1 now. King to e7, we don't bother castling in this position. The queens are off the board and we are playing a queenless middle game. And it's okay for the king to be in the center here, and we've just connected our rooks. Knight d2. So knight could come to the queen side, it could come to e4 perhaps. Knight e5, that square was vacated. Knight b3, the queen side it is. Rook to b8, just defending that bishop because knight a5 was a threat. Knight a5 anyway, and bishop a8, not wanting to give up the bishop pair just yet. And a4. Idea is simple, we'll weaken the queenside pawns and probably even grab the a6 pawn. B takes a4, this is reasonable. Knight takes, and we can't really save that a pawn, so h5. One advantage of not castling and keeping the rook on the h file is that you can start a pawn storm there and perhaps create some weaknesses on white's king side. Bishop takes a6, just grab the pawn. h4. We don't want to allow h3 by black because then maybe g3 and then that long diagonal is quite exposed. So h3 preventing, and g5 now. The idea is just to open lines in front of the white king. There are many ways to continue. Perhaps a simple way could be knight c5, just going after the b7 square. And of course, the pawn on b2 cannot be grabbed because if rook takes b2, then bishop c3 is very, very annoying. The rook is under threat, there's pressure on e5, and then if that knight moves on f6, and then there's a pin. So something like rook b to b8 and bishop b7. If, let's say, you try to move the knight back, you could have knight takes d7. You also have to keep in mind that knight c6 check is a threat, so you have to keep a knight on e5 to cover the c6 square. And here king takes d7 would have to be played, and then rook d1. Very, very good for white. So after something like bishop takes b7 here, bishop b7 here, you'll have to, let's say, capture knight c takes, keeping the a knight there so that knight c6 is always a threat. Rook h to c8, for instance. Knight takes d6, king takes d6, and bishop takes e5. We lure the king up the board. And after knight c4 check, there is no good square for the black king. You'll have to give up the exchange in some form or the other. Rook to c4 and rook into c4 is reasonable, because if king to f5, the knight d6 wins more than the exchange. King to d5, knight b6 wins the exchange, because after rook into b6 we can take the rook on c8. So after knight c5, black would have to be very careful not to go for that very seemingly active move, rook into b2. We'll have to continue with some discretion, something like knight d5, just centralizing that piece. It's not a target on f6 later on. Knight a to b7 now is possible, going after that bishop or forcing the light square bishop to exchange, and then knight takes b7. To ease the pressure, you could have knight d3, a swap of knights, bishop takes and rook takes b7. White would be slightly better here with the two bishops. Probably that extra b pawn will be rounded up at some point of time. Black should have some chances to hold the game, certainly. But this is quite pleasant to play. But after g5, f3 was played. Now white really cannot claim much of an advantage. Sooner rather than later, black will probably have something to bite on in front of the king. So general principle is that if pawns are coming in front of your king, you don't want to push the pawns in front of your own king, because that gives something to bite on. And we'll see how that works out in practice. So knight d5 first, going after that weak e3 pawn. Bishop d2 defending, and bishop b4. Bishop takes b4 and rook takes b4. There is still pressure down the b file. King f2 defending the pawn, and f5 now. There were some ways to play this. b3 is an idea. You secure that knight one more time. You have to play a move anyway, so it gives you something to play. Maybe the bishop can cement itself on c4 later. That could be possible. Let's say something like g4 here, knight c5 again, and g3, king e2, rook hb8. Both sides have some chances to play on. It's quite balanced. After b3 there could be rook hb8, just doubling down. Knight c5 again. Knight d7 trying to exchange the pieces, and knight takes and king takes, and rook c5. Quite active. And the knight on a5 actually is not grim, as we normally say a knight on the rim is grim or dim. It had some threats of coming to b7 or c6 at some point of time, and it's quite active. It's quite important in defending b3. Let's say king e7, rook ac1, and king f6. So the king is safe from any rook checks later on, and it's quite tucked in on f6, and this is also quite playable. But after f5, rook e3 was played, and this is not as precise, and we'll see why. After g4, of course, b3 here is the best, but now we see that the rook is a bit misplaced on a3. What is the rook really doing there? It can't swing to the king side anytime. Now rook b to b8 would be played. Knight to b2 and knight b4, that was the point. We want to get into the position, and let's say bishop e2, because the bishop was threatened. Now we give a g3 check, because the king can't go to e2, the king has to go to f1, and king f6. And this is slightly favorable for black than in the previous version, because the rooks were much more active. One rook came on c5 and the other rook, the a rook, came on c1. In this case, that's not possible, and we've given some initiative to black. But after g4, f4 was played, and that is actually a losing move if black finds the right continuation. In fact, you can just go with g3 here, king g1, and then knight goes back to d7, and we see some ideas that there is pressure on that a4 knight and on the e3 pawn. So knight takes e3 and then rook takes a4. That's a threat. So rook c2 a1 would have to be played, and then king f6. Good place for the king, and soon we've passed over the move to white, and if let's say the bishop moves, then it no longer controls c8, and we can activate the rook. And black is the one who will be in control here. White will be tied down to defending. But another interesting way to play it was knight into f4, just give up a piece. Objectively, this is not as strong, and white will have chances to hold the position after e takes f4 and rook takes f4 and king e3. But certainly it's not an easy job to do it on the board. Rook e4 check and king f2 and g takes h3. And it happened. White cracked under the pressure and played knight b6, which is a terrible mistake. Simply g takes h3 would have allowed the game to go on. Rook g8, trying to get something down the g file. Bishop e2, rook f4 check and king e1, let's say, and bishop f3. Trying to maybe get the knight there on f3, which would be quite good if white were to exchange, but white can play rook c5. Rook e4 defending the knight, and rook takes e5. Rook takes e5 and rook takes f3. So there's been a swap of pieces. We can see the material that a knight and a bishop for a rook and a pawn. This should be balanced. But after knight b6, black simply ignored white. You can even play h2 here, by the way. That's not what black played, but h2, and giving up that bishop there. We don't even bother with the knight. We play rook t8, and we'll notice that the g3, f3 and e3 squares are all covered, and rook t2 would be a terrible threat, and then queening, of course. The g1 squares are also covered, incidentally. So knight c6 check, deflecting the knight, and rook e3. But rook f4, rook f3, and rook t2 check. It's hopelessly lost for white here. You can't go back because then a queen comes. So king e3 here, but rook c2. If the c1 rook moves, then you queen. And if you grab the f4 rook, we grab on c1 and then we'll queen. That's it. Nothing can be done. So if you find h2 and then after knight grab you find rook t8, you will see that you are completely winning. However, rook f4 was played, which is still fine. King to e3 and rook e4. We have some repetition. King f2 and rook f4 check. King e3 and rook b4. Knight a8, and again we don't bother capturing that knight. We play h takes g2. And we see that the pawns are so threatening. Rook to b3 here. What do you play here? Do we grab that rook in exchange? No, we play h3. We don't bother with the rook. And of course, if rook into b4, then simply h2. King runs, let's say, to f2, h1 queen. Nothing more to be done. But bishop b7 was played, trying to prevent h2, but simply rook takes b7. And this comes with rook into b7 check. But there's nothing to worry, simply king f6, and white has no move. If we count the material, black is down a rook and a knight, but those two pawns are so strong that black is completely winning, and it was here in this position that Daniel Dardha resigned. And a very nice victory for Mustafa Yilmaz. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon to the next game.